by which the energy could reach into the most remote areas of space. Magnetism assumes that this energy is not strictly free-moving, that while it is everywhere and in everything, it is channeled, and that within space itself are certain processes or channels by means of which the free motion of energy retains a form or a kind and is not dissipated. We have the same concept today, for in broadcasting a radio program, we know that the program does not pass in its visible or audible form from the sending station to the receiving station, but that it is transformed into waves of energy, and that these waves of energy retain their own organization. They are not like another drop of water dropped into water that is instantly dispelled. Rather, it seems as though they might be drops of water dropped into oil, where they remain isolated and retain their own form and structure. Or perhaps we can liken them to the grooves on a phonograph record. For without these grooves, without this systematic process, by means of which the sounds or vibrations are held, in this case upon the substance of the record, they could not be reproduced. Thus, in nature, the magnetic substance also supplies this medium of carriage, and later became associated with the great so-called medium of science, the hypothetical substance, ether, which was used without much understanding to explain other mysteries still less understood. In the development, therefore, of this concept, mind was able to direct magnetism. Mind was able to direct magnetism from a person to another person. And for all that we or Mesmer could know, this mind was capable of projecting magnetism to an indefinite distance. This indefinite distance, perhaps constituting the sympathy which has been recorded between persons at a great distance, who still were conscious or aware of the actions of each other, as in the case perhaps of the death of Lord Nelson, for at the time he died at Trafalgar, Lady Hamilton fell in a swoon in England, declaring that Nelson was dead. This sympathy, according to Paracelsus, was due to the possibility of the projection of the mind in the field of magnetism, and would simply be a very rarefied, attenuated parallel to our concept of radio transmission. Magnetism may then likewise be controlled or directed within the body of the individual by the mind of that individual, meaning that magnetism can be intensified in one part of the body or another, according as need may arise. This subtle substance could therefore be molded, as a child molds sand in a sandbox, that it could be directed by an action of the volition, of the animate will, and could be caused to be greater in one part of the body than in another, or could be reduced in one area, so as to effect whatever remedy might be needed. Nature, apparently, has done this itself. And here is an interesting theory about which we may hear more sometime. If volition, consciousness, and mind are the peculiar agents by means of which magnetism can be drawn, then in all probability nature has set up pain mechanism for that purpose. In other words, pain causes acute awareness. Pain causes the individual to turn his attention upon the area where the pain exists. Pain accompanies many forms of injury, and pain seems to be a subconscious natural remedy by means of which healing materials are drawn to the area with the attention of the sufferer. Pain sets up a local voice, a local vibratory rate, and to this area, of which we have become peculiarly aware through pain, energy has a tendency to flow. As an example of the truth of this particular point, we can mention that hypnosis will cause the person to be unaware of pain in an area, or become aware of a pain in some other area where it does not exist. Therefore, pain is essentially a mental phenomenon. This phenomenon, furthermore, has to do with the need of energy. And wherever this pain occurs or is set up, the person gains a greater awareness of that particular area. In the old researches, the simile is to the man who hits his thumb with a hammer. That instantly magnetism moves into that area. Actually, for a moment, the individual forgets himself and remembers only his thumb. His consciousness centers upon his thumb. And with the center of consciousness moves the energy or magnetism. Therefore, a very heavy congestion of magnetism containing necessary elements of energy gather at this point. As the pain resides, the individual becomes less aware of this particular area and is no longer conscious that it is giving him trouble. Other things besides pain can cause the gathering of energy. If these other things are not relevant, if there is no real need of energy in the area to which it is suddenly drawn in an exaggerated way, it will set up tension or hypertension. We know in the pharmacopoeia that there are certain medications which, if taken by healthy persons, will make them sick. But if taken by persons suffering from certain ailments, will assist to remedy that ailment, or will bring immediate relief. It is, for example, rather well noted that a person suffering from extreme pain may use certain narcotics with comparative safety, but if he uses them without the pain, he is very likely to become addicted to narcotics. In magnetism, the same principle seems to hold true. Wherever man turns his attention, particularly within his own body, he is apt to embarrass this rather shy and retiring structure. For instance, a man who becomes stomach conscious, or who becomes too much interested in some function of the body, is likely to disturb that function by drawing to it energy which is not required. A singer, becoming too conscious of the structure of the throat and the technique of voice production, will have difficulty in singing and will lock his voice. Whereas if he becomes completely absorbed in his music and becomes unaware of his own existence, he will sing with relaxation. These seem to indicate not mere tension, but tension drawing materials. And these materials, not being necessary, cause a superabundance, which in itself becomes a difficulty. If, however, these materials of desperately needed for some remedial process, then the centering of energy brings with it relief and help. We might go so far as to suspect that egoism or egotism, excessive self-centeredness upon the concept of ego or upon the concept of self may cause tension in this area and may be one of the causes of why the egotist is seldom a happy or well-adjusted person. Centering energy where it is not necessary, where it literally and actually does more harm than good. Energy is to be centered only for emergence. And when it is otherwise centered, it is of little value. Also, the magnetic field becomes an immediate carrier of mental impulse, much more rapid, much more powerful than any conscious process can be. A good example of this is learning to play the piano. The individual must go through a considerable preliminary period of training. The purpose of the training being to gradually eliminate hand consciousness. As long as he must guide his hands by an active process of volition, he will be slow and stumbling in his usage. When, however, he reaches the point where the hands react automatically to the impulses of the mind and will, so that they become comparatively unknown to him, but serve him effectively, then he becomes a more satisfactory artist. It seems then that mental energy can be carried almost instantaneously to any part of the body where it is needed, and that this subjective method of communication with the parts of the body is more necessary and more important than any conscious willing of these parts to perform a specific action. The next point, again, follows from these, and that is that the mind, being able to direct energy, is subject to certain limitations and infirmities of its own, by means of which the direction of energy may be wrong, or may miscarry. Or in the case of the magnetic healer, there is always the possibility that a preconception of the nature of the ailment, a faulty diagnosis, a demand for the use of energy in a certain way may bring the patient difficulty rather than improvement. It is therefore true in this as in all other things that the energy field of the patient must determine the patient's needs and not the intellectual attitudes of the physician. This is subtle and takes away from the field some of its most interesting aspects. We are curtailed in our glorious privilege of exerting mind over matter. We are no longer set up as arbitrary determinants of what others need. We have so long attempted to diagnose by formula, by tradition, by precedent, and by certain schools of technique, that it has not occurred to us that the magnetic field of the patient is a living diagnosis at all times. You may remember, of course, the charming story of Caesar's Column by Ignatius Dante. In this story, which anticipates the progress of man into the future with something of the spirit of Edward Bellamy, but perhaps not quite so optimistic, an invention is described, resembling a watch, which the individual can wear as he would a watch, and can look at it whenever he feels like it, look at his watch and say, a little bilious today. With this magnetic instrument, small but powerful, will enable him to tell at any time the condition of his own health. The operation of the instrument, of course, depends upon magnetism. This has not yet quite been perfected. We might have done it by now had we not been more interested in reaching Mars or one of the other members of the remote solar family. But it is still conceivable that such a device could be devised. And it is even more important to remember that the magnetic field of the body must always present the true and inevitable condition of that body. Therefore, it is not the mind of the individual who is judging, nor is it the mind of the patient who is explaining his symptoms. It is actually the state of the electric current of the body and their relation to the needs of the occasion. Thus, the tendency to create a highly arbitrary system of therapy is to a major check, and we begin to consider the various moral and ethical involvement. The individual can recover only when he ceases to cause his own sickness. If he ceases to cause it, he in all probability will be gradually relieved of its symptoms unless the damage has gone too far. Then he may be assisted, or he may be beyond assistance, as the case may be. But certainly, the condition of the body is the result of a certain psychic pattern pressed upon the body by what Bailey calls a seal of the composite archetype of the character itself. The magnetist approaching this has only one of two or three courses open. He must either develop that kind of internal sight by means of which he can read the magnetic field accurately. And this particular ability is not always possible. He has a second recourse, and that is to merely provide the body with an additional amount of energy derived either from his own body or from some adequate source of magnetism. There is a third possibility, and this is perhaps the one that can come the closest to our present comprehension. And that is that it is conceivable and possible for the individual to feel or to sense without seeing, to know as though intuitively the condition, the magnetic field of another person. He thus is given the impulse. It may come into him and be interpreted with extraordinary clarity. In some cases, magnetists have actually experienced in various parts of their bodies the very pain from which their patients suffer. More usually, however, it is a kind of mental recognition. A recognition like a flash of inspiration. A recognition which is a sudden knowing, which would seem to imply, in turn, that the magnetic field of the other person was capable of sending a message or transmitting a message, which flowing into the magnetic field of the physician was transformed into a mental idea. Many so-called magnetic healers of modern times have described their abilities to diagnose as being this intuitive method, or this extraordinary circumstance of suddenly feeling in the corresponding part of their own bodies the ailments from which the sufferer complains. type of cognition is itself apparently a transmission of magnetism to the nervous system. The next interesting phase of our problem begins the study of what can we do to take the place of thinking in order to control by the mind or by some attribute of consciousness the function of the magnetic field, either our own or someone else's. Early in the 19th century, it was pointed out that certain broad, general attitudes seemingly cause broad and genuine changes within the magnetic structure. And entirely apart from their interest in theology, these researchers came very close to the opinion of St. Paul as expressed in Corinthians. For it was learned through experience that the three most powerful emotional or mental projections by means of which therapy could be attained in the magnetic field were the three attitudes of faith, hope, and love. These were therapeutic. Hate destroys. Love restores. Faith is built or created. Fear or lack of faith destroys. Hope was a creator. Despair destroyed. Now in our conscious living, these various attitudes stumble about in almost constant confusion. One moment we are hopeful and the next we are fearful. In one moment we have faith and in another moment we are faithless. Let us assume certain principles to see whether they make sense, perhaps better sense than we suspect. During the last 50 years, perhaps a little more, the civilizations which have led the world for centuries have gradually developed a powerful materialistic concept or culture. Until today, the leaders in our various walks of life are very often persons of little faith. They have not recognized the importance of strong, constructive belief in terms of health. Having lost much of their religious anchorage and having no firm ethical structure to take its place or to even help to compensate for its loss, we find it quite conceivable that the general lowering of the level of simple faith, faith in good, faith in right, faith in truth, faith in God, that the losses in these forms of faith might very well result in a general